The morning of November 26, 1863, carried a cold stillness over St. Mary's County, the kind of quiet that makes people lower their voices without realizing why. Across the region, barns were being swept, tables decorated, and fires fed in preparation for the very first Thanksgiving, declared a national holiday. President Abraham Lincoln had insisted the fractured nation pause to breathe, to unite in gratitude even as Civil War battles left fields soaked with blood. In border states like Maryland, where slavery remained legal despite Union loyalty, this holiday felt like a contradiction wrapped in ceremony. Families tried to cling to normal routines, pretending they were far removed from the violence tearing the country apart, though gunfire in distant states echoed in every whispered conversation. On the Miller estate, a wealthy stretch of 300 acres surrounded by forest thick enough to swallow screams, those illusions of harmony were carefully preserved by those in power and forcibly maintained by those enslaved beneath them. The Miller house stood tall and immaculate, 3 stories of red brick polished by the labor of people who didn't own their own names. Visitors admired the manicured gardens and tobacco fields, imagining a peaceful southern idyll. But beauty is a mask, and the Millers had mastered the art of hiding rot beneath varnish. 200 meters beyond the main house, behind sprawling oaks older than the Republic itself, rose a structure locals never mentioned above a murmur, the Correction Barn. It was windowless, always locked, its wooden walls darkened by generations of secrets. Clemens, the estate's butler, knew every inch of it. He knew where the boards creaked, where chains hung, where stains on the dirt floor never fully washed away. He had spent decades forced to witness punishments there, standing silent while Anthony Miller administered discipline with cold precision. The barn reeked of old blood, sweat, and misery, an odor so deeply embedded in the grain of the wood that no amount of scrubbing ever removed it. Haley, who worked in the kitchen, carried reminders of that barn etched into her very body. At 14, she'd stolen a piece of bread for her feverish little brother Daniel. Anthony saw theft as rebellion, and rebellion demanded spectacle. Before the entire enslaved community, he pressed her hand against a board and used a heated chisel to sever 2 of her fingers. The flesh had sizzled, smoke rising as if the barn itself exhaled the cruelty done inside it. Daniel had been forced to watch, frozen in terror. He was never the same. 2 years later, Anthony sold him to a farm in Virginia, citing his lethargy. Haley never saw her brother again, and every time she used her mutilated hand to chop vegetables or knead dough, she carried the memory of that winter afternoon like a phantom limb of grief. If Anthony was brutality in its loudest form, his wife Rose was cruelty in scripture. Quiet, decorated, sanctified. She managed the household with unforgiving vigilance. A linen folded slightly uneven could mean days without food. A dish served lukewarm could send a girl into solitary confinement. Yet Rose reserved her darkest practices for the basement during her so-called catechism sessions. Girls between 12 and 15 were forced to kneel on dried corn while she read passages about obedience and sin. Their knees bled, their backs stiffened, their tears dried into silent salt. She designed fasts that lasted days, locked them in darkness until they hallucinated, and called each torment a divine cleansing. 3 girls died under her supervision in different years. Infection, starvation, cold. Rose insisted God had taken them, that she had merely guided their souls toward purity. When she prayed over their bodies, the girls who survived whispered that her voice sounded more like pride than remorse. Clemens had not always lived under Anthony's direct rule. Born in 1826 to field slaves, he spent his early childhood unaware of the full depth of the estate's cruelty. At 7, he had been selected to serve in the big house under the elderly matriarch, a woman of stern manners but not sadistic whims. He learned to arrange silverware, pour wine without noise, interpret subtle gestures at dinner tables. Later, he married Sally, and for a few brief years, he almost allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. They had 3 children. They laughed at night. They dreamed quietly. But any moment of peace on an enslaved person's horizon is fragile, one harsh decision away from collapse. In 1854, when Anthony inherited the estate and discovered his gambling debts, he sold 2 of Clemens's sons, 6 and 8 years old, to a cotton farm in Louisiana. They were taken without warning. When Clemens returned from the market, he found Sally collapsed on the floor. her grief so raw she couldn't form recognizable words. They were forbidden to mourn, but grief has a way of carving its own shape, even under punishment. For nearly a decade after losing his sons, Clemens perfected invisibility. He became the man who blended into walls, who overheard everything without being noticed, who moved silently enough for the Millers to forget he existed. Haley developed her own form of invisibility in the kitchen. Her daughter Grace, only 8, worked in the fields. Mother and child saw each other only at dusk, each night a small ritual of counting fingers, checking for bruises, confirming survival. The war rumbled like distant thunder that could not yet be felt. Union troops freed enslaved people further north, but Maryland remained in its strange legal purgatory, loyal to the Union, but still practicing slavery. Anthony ordered that no one speak of the Emancipation Proclamation, as if silence could stop its implications from spreading through whispered networks among the enslaved. In late spring, he revealed to dinner guests that he planned to sell Clemens's surviving daughter Hope after the fall festivities. 14 years old, he said, she would fetch a fine price in Charleston for controlled breeding. Clemens poured wine with steady hands while something inside him split irrevocably. Clemens did not speak that night after serving the dinner where Hope's fate had been announced like a casual business transaction. But when he stepped outside into the chilled spring air, the silence around him felt different, charged, almost alive. Later, in the dim space between the slave quarters and the storage shed, Haley approached him. They spoke in whispers so soft the wind couldn't carry them. Haley had heard the conversation, and her expression mirrored the fracture he felt inside. They discussed Grace and Hope, the impossibility of allowing Anthony to sell another child, and the fact that if either girl tried to run alone, they would be dragged back and punished without mercy. That night marked the beginning of a conspiracy shaped not by impulsive rage, but by the cold, disciplined determination of people who had spent their entire lives waiting for a chance that rarely came twice. The weeks that followed moved with deceptive calm. Clemens polished silver, served meals, and listened to conversations about tobacco yields. Haley cooked elaborate dinners while watching Rose glide through rooms like a queen convinced of divine favor. But beneath this routine, invisible threads connected small, deliberate actions. Arsenic was kept in the storage shed for controlling rats in the tobacco barns, highly toxic, easily overlooked, rarely inventoried. Clemens removed small amounts over time, never enough to draw suspicion. Haley hid the powder inside an old tin containing rare spices she knew the Millers rarely requested. They avoided discussing the plan in detail unless absolutely necessary, speaking mostly through glances. If the plan failed, they knew what awaited them: branding, mutilation, execution. But hesitation was a luxury enslaved people were never granted, and the looming sale of hope turned fear into fuel. October arrived with a harsh reminder of the estate's brutality. Sally accidentally broke a porcelain bowl while washing dishes, a minor accident in any other household, but Rose saw it as defiance. Anthony summoned her to the correction barn and administered 50 lashes, stopping only when sweat dripped from his brow. Sally was 4 months pregnant. He knew this and still raised the whip. Clemens stood present as required, his expression blank, his mind detaching from the sound of each strike. The wounds became infected within days. Fever consumed Sally as she lay on a thin mattress in their quarters. Rose refused to call a doctor, saying treatment was wasted on someone replaceable. For 11 days, Clemens stayed at Sally's side every moment he could, holding her hand as it grew colder. She died before sunrise on the 11th day, the unborn child with her. When Clemens informed Anthony, the man waved dismissively, instructing a burial on the slave cemetery hill. Compassion was not something Anthony Miller had ever practiced. Her death changed the nature of the plan. No longer was this solely about hope or grace. It was about Sally, about Daniel, about the 3 girls who never survived Rose's catechisms, about decades of suffering carried by countless nameless people whose only crime was existing under the wrong lineage. As Clemens stood behind Anthony's chair the morning Sally died, holding a silver tray, he made a silent vow that the Millers' reign of cruelty would end within the year. Haley agreed, not with words, but with a firm nod on the night they met again behind the quarters. Together, they finished the final pieces of a plan that had grown bigger than escape. It had become justice, brutal, irreversible, precise. With Thanksgiving approaching, the Miller household shifted into its annual performance of wealth. Wagons arrived carrying extended relatives. Children ran through halls unaware they were surrounded by ghosts who had died long before their time. Rose ordered the house scrubbed twice over. Anthony wore new suits as if to impress his siblings. Haley cooked from dawn to dusk, ham, turkey, pies, dishes requiring hours of preparation. Clemens curated the wine cellar with the obsessive care expected of him, polishing each bottle until its dark glass gleamed. The Millers believed Thanksgiving was the perfect occasion to showcase their prosperity. They did not know it would be their final act. On the afternoon of November 25th, Haley descended the stone steps into the wine cellar under the pretext of retrieving bottles for the next day's dinner. The air down there was cold and damp. She carried the small cloth bags containing carefully measured arsenic, her mutilated hand trembling slightly. She uncorked 12 red wine bottles, 6 brandies, 4 whiskies, only those intended for adults. The powder dissolved instantly into the dark liquids, leaving no trace. She worked quickly but carefully, recorking each bottle and arranging them exactly as Clemens had instructed. Twice she froze when footsteps crossed the floor above, heart pounding so forcefully she worried someone might hear. When she finished, she wiped down every surface she had touched, then returned to the kitchen wearing the same obedient expression Rose expected. Clemens inspected everything after Haley's return. Children drank cider and milk, untouched. The adults would drink poison disguised as luxury. Timing had been calculated meticulously. Symptoms would begin 40 to 60 minutes after ingestion, speeding through the body like a chain reaction. There would be vomiting, convulsions, bleeding, finally, organ collapse. By then, the enslaved workers needed to be gone, scattered into the night long before neighbors arrived. To avoid suspicion, only the escape portion of the plan was revealed to other enslaved people. 38 agreed to run when the signal came. 9 would remain behind, elderly, injured, or children too fragile to travel. Clemens and Haley planned provisions for them, leaving bread and water as tokens of care even amid impending chaos. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a sharp wind slicing through bare branches. Inside the Miller house, the mood was festive. Laughter echoed in rooms where brutality had once sounded louder. The long dining table stood adorned with gleaming silver and flawless porcelain, symbols of wealth carved from years of stolen labor. At precisely 5 o'clock, the family gathered. Children sat at a separate table. Adults filled their glasses with deep red wine. Clemens stood behind Anthony's chair, hands steady, face unreadable. Haley coordinated dishes with perfect timing. The Millers began their celebration, unaware they had already consumed their fate. When the first signs appeared shortly after 8, confusion rippled through the room. Anthony's uncle complained of nausea, followed by Rose's sister gripping her stomach in sudden pain. Anthony blamed Haley immediately, insisting she had ruined the meat. But before he could finish the accusation, he doubled over, retching violently across the table. Chaos erupted, servants fled, children burst into tears. Vomit spread across plates, linens, and polished floors. Some adults attempted to remain dignified, wiping their mouths with trembling hands, but the poison forced truth into the open. Suffering will not bow to etiquette. Panic transformed the grand dining room into a chamber of chaos within minutes. Vomit splattered across the white linen tablecloth, mixing with spilled wine until the floor resembled a battlefield more than a family gathering. Anthony tried to rise from his chair, perhaps to regain control as he always did, but his legs buckled beneath him. His body struck the floor with a heavy thud, the sound echoing through the room like a final declaration of his failing power. Blood streaked the corners of his mouth as he gasped for breath, veins bulging along his neck with each convulsive spasm. Rose staggered toward the doorway, trying to command order through her own heaving breaths, but a surge of pain doubled her over before she could issue more than a strangled cry. When she lifted her head again, streaks of red stained the silk bodice she had chosen to impress her relatives. The holiday she had planned to showcase her family's prestige had twisted into a nightmare she could not pray away. Children huddled together near the staircase, eyes wide with terror as the world they trusted crumbled in front of them. They watched adults, pillars of their comfort, collapse, writhe, and choke. The youngest, a 4-year-old girl, called desperately for her mother, who convulsed in front of the fireplace, limbs jerking in sharp, unnatural movements. An 8-year-old boy tried to drag his father away from the table, sobbing as the man's body convulsed uncontrollably and slipped from his grasp. Upstairs, young enslaved women rushed in at Haley's signal, gathering the children, guiding them towards safety with urgent whispers. They locked themselves inside bedrooms on the second floor, trying to shield the children from the horrors below, humming soft lullabies that cracked every few notes. The floorboards shook beneath them, carrying sounds no child should ever hear. Wet, retching screams that stretched into gurgles, and the rhythmic thud of bodies collapsing. Downstairs, 2 of Anthony's cousins attempted to crawl toward the front door, perhaps driven by instinct to flee or hope that fresh air would ease their torment. Their progress was slow, every movement punctured by stabbing abdominal pain. One reached the porch before collapsing, blood pouring from his nose and mouth as the poison shredded his insides. Near the window, Rose's sister-in-law convulsed so violently her head struck the floor repeatedly, each blow creating a dull crack. Frothy pink foam bubbled from her lips, eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. The poison tore through nervous systems without mercy. Dignity dissolved into primal suffering. Clemens watched with the cold detachment of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. His face revealed nothing, no triumph, no regret, only the resolve of a man who had crossed the point of no return long before the first bottle was uncorked. When Clemens slipped away from the carnage, he walked with measured calm, descending the cellar stairs to the alarm bell. It was usually used to summon enslaved workers during emergencies. Tonight it served the opposite purpose. 3 long tolls echoed across the estate, a sound the enslaved people had been waiting for. Outside, the fugitives sprang into motion. Some gathered bundles prepared days earlier, others whispered hurried prayers. Children were scooped into arms. Darkness became both shield and path as they prepared to abandon the estate forever. Meanwhile, Haley ushered Grace and Hope toward the slave quarters, where others joined them. She looked back only once, more instinct than hesitation, before pushing forward into the night. The group separated as planned into 3 smaller parties, each taking different routes through the forest to avoid mass capture. Inside the dining room, the poison's final stages were unfolding. Internal bleeding worsened, staining clothes with dark red patches. Muscles seized violently as organs failed. Anthony managed to lift his head when Clemens briefly re-entered the room for a final check. Recognition flickered in Anthony's deteriorating gaze. The man who had treated Clemens like living furniture suddenly understood, too late, that obedience had never been the same as loyalty. Anthony tried to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to curse, but only a thick, wet gurgle came out. Clemens held his gaze for a long, still moment, not out of pity, but because this was the only time in their entire lives when they stood at equal height. Then Clemens turned away, leaving the man who had destroyed his family to die alone against the wall he once decorated with expensive wallpaper. Rose clung stubbornly to life longer than anyone else, fighting as if sheer willpower could overpower poison. Her hands clawed at the table legs as she dragged herself toward the edge of the room, leaving smears of blood in her wake. Her gold cross swung wildly from her neck with each convulsion, catching the faint candlelight in frantic flashes. Even as her vision faded and her prayers fractured into broken murmurs, she struggled to maintain control. For decades she had ruled her household through fear disguised as righteousness, but Arsenic recognized no hierarchy, no divine authority. When her final convulsion struck, her body bowed twice before collapsing fully, her fingers finally unclenching. The first death came before 9 o'clock. Anthony's older brother, a man who had boasted earlier about his war stories, simply stilled, his body twisted at an unnatural angle by the fireplace. His open eyes stared upward, unseeing. Rose's sister-in-law followed minutes later, limbs frozen mid-spasm. By 10, Anthony was gone too, slumped against the wall that now bore streaks from his desperate attempts to stand. Upstairs, the enslaved women held the children close, whispering reassurances they did not believe. They knew the screams were slowly fading because there were fewer living throats left to produce them. By midnight, The Miller estate had transformed from a place of celebration into a mausoleum. 18 adults lay scattered, some in the dining room, others collapsed in hallways where they had attempted escape. One crumpled on the porch under the pale moonlight. Only Thomas, the 15-year-old boy allowed to dine at the adult table for the first time, remained alive upstairs, but not for long. By dawn, he too had succumbed, dying alone in his room with signs of agony etched onto his face. He had likely called for help that never came. 18 bodies had cooled overnight. The 19th would cool alongside the morning light. When the enslaved women finally dared to venture downstairs, the sight awaiting them defied comprehension. The dining room looked frozen in the moment between holiday festivity and grotesque ruin. Silverware lay scattered across the floor. Plates remained on the table, some still holding half-eaten slices of pie, but everywhere, on chairs, rugs, walls, were stains of bodily fluids, blood, and the unmistakable smell of sickness and death. One woman retreated immediately, vomiting in the hallway before collapsing against the banister in shock. Another ran upstairs and locked the door behind her, trembling so violently she struggled to turn the key. They waited, terrified, caring for the surviving children, praying the night's horrors would end with sunrise. By late morning on November 27th, the Miller estate remained eerily silent. No smoke rose from the chimneys, an unsettling break from routine that neighbors quickly noticed. Wealthy households always kept fires burning, especially after hosting large gatherings. William Peters, the nearest farmer, glanced toward the Miller property several times as he supervised his workers. By 11, he felt a tightening in his chest, an intuition cultivated by decades of rural life. He sent his 19-year-old son James to ride over and check. James expected to find a household sleeping off a night of celebration, but the moment he approached the main house, an unnatural stillness settled over him. Birds avoided the trees nearest the house. The front door stood ajar. The odor reached him first, a thick, metallic stench mingling with something sour and unmistakably rotten. He stepped inside and froze as if the world had suddenly narrowed into a single unbearable moment. 19 bodies lay contorted across floors and furniture, some collapsed over chairs, others sprawled in hallways. The remnants of Thanksgiving dinner still sat on the table, framed grotesquely by the carnage around it. James stumbled backward, retreated to the porch, and vomited violently before fleeing on horseback, terror propelling him faster than rational thought. When William heard his son's breathless, fragmented report, he gathered 2 of his older boys and rode to the Miller estate with a sense of grim resolve. A former soldier who had witnessed battlefield death, he braced himself, but nothing prepared him for death in a dining room meant for celebration. Unlike war, where violence comes with warning and uniform, this was domestic life twisted into horror. William forced himself to walk room by room, noting each body, each stain, each overturned chair. It was he who discovered faint cries upstairs. Following the sound, he found 6 children huddled together in a bedroom, guarded by 2 terrified young enslaved women. The youngest clung to him instantly, sobbing into his coat, while the others stared at him with hollow, frightened eyes. The women explained in trembling voices what little they knew. Dinner had begun normally, then screams erupted, and Haley had ordered them to take the children upstairs and stay put. They had not left the room again until sunrise, and when they finally ventured down, the world had changed. William quickly understood the implications: poisoning, mass escape, and a community unprepared to confront such an event. He sent his youngest son to gallop to Leonardtown for the sheriff and doctor. Sheriff John Hafford arrived that afternoon with Dr. Edmund Price and several men. Hafford's experience with crime did not extend to scenes like this. He rubbed his temples repeatedly as he attempted to take statements. Dr. Price conducted examinations with clinical calm, his fingers tracing the signs: blood in the vomit, rigid limbs, dilated pupils, the distinct pattern of internal bleeding. Years earlier, he had studied poisoning cases in Baltimore. He did not need long to reach a conclusion: arsenic. In the wine cellar, he found empty bottles whose contents had been consumed almost entirely by adults. He smelled only alcohol. Arsenic leaves no scent. Children's drinks had remained untouched, an omission that spoke volumes. Someone had spared them intentionally. Someone who understood pain intimately, yet refused to inflict it on the innocent. News spread through Leonardtown by evening. The scandal shook the small community with the force of an earthquake. Some whispered that enslaved people had risen in senseless violence. Others, lowering their voices further, muttered that Anthony had long been too cruel, that perhaps the world had finally swallowed what he had built. But even those who harbored resentment toward the Millers avoided speaking too loudly. Discussing justice in a system built atop injustice was risky for anyone. Halford attempted to organize a search party, but the war had drained the region of able-bodied men. Only 12 volunteers joined the effort: old farmers, 2 teenage boys, and a handful of local workers. They searched the forests through Saturday and Sunday with dogs and rifles, but the trails were cold. Rain from the night before masked footprints. The fugitives had used knowledge of the terrain to vanish long before neighbors arrived. By Monday, the search was called off. The county simply did not have the manpower to pursue 38 desperate escapees into dense wilderness. The bodies were buried on Sunday in a hastily assembled ceremony behind the church. 19 coffins lined the soil, though the last few were little more than wooden crates hammered together that morning. The Reverend read verses about divine mystery and human fragility, but his voice shook. How does one bless a tragedy born from cruelty years in the making? The 6 surviving children were divided among relatives like parcels. Siblings were separated without hesitation. The 4-year-old girl was taken by an aunt in Annapolis, who accepted her with visible reluctance. The 8-year-old boy was sent to Baltimore. None of the cousins wanted to keep the Miller property. Once the funerals were complete, discussions turned quickly to liquidation. No family member wished to inherit a house that smelled of death and whispered with rumor. They decided to sell everything: the land, the house, the barns. Yet when the estate was listed, buyers recoiled. Locals wouldn't go near the property, and outsiders heard whispers before they saw deeds. Over the next few years, the price dropped repeatedly until a land speculator bought it at a fraction of its value, planning to resell once memories faded. They never did. Meanwhile, Clemens, Haley, Hope, Grace, and the remaining fugitives pressed deeper into the forest. The first 72 hours were the most perilous. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in 2-hour shifts, always leaving someone awake to watch for torches or dogs. Hunger gnawed at them as supplies dwindled. Small berries and wild roots kept them alive but weak. Grace, exhausted and shivering, asked when she could rest. Haley lifted her without complaint, muscles burning, her heart steeled by fear and resolve. On the 4th day, north of the estate, they found the first underground railroad station, the farm of Isaac Peaton, a Quaker who risked imprisonment by hiding fugitives. Peaton ushered them into a false floor beneath his barn, served hot soup and bread, and offered blankets warmer than any they had known. Some cried for the first time since the escape. Others ate in stunned silence, realizing they had truly survived the first part of their journey. During their second night there, Peaton returned from town carrying news: 19 dead at the Miller estate, poisoned on Thanksgiving. Search party disorganized, hunt abandoned. Clemens absorbed the information silently, his face unreadable. Haley closed her eyes, seeing faces she had not expected to see again, not alive, not dead. Hope reached for her father's hand. He squeezed gently, but did not speak. Peaton did not judge. He simply said they needed to reach Pennsylvania quickly. The next stretch would be dangerous. Peaton guided Clemens, Haley, and the others through coded routes of the Underground Railroad, each stop a fragile sanctuary in a landscape filled with danger. When they left his farm, their small group split. Some fugitives continued with them, others branched toward different safe houses, afraid that traveling in numbers would attract suspicion. Pennsylvania's rolling hills offered more cover than Maryland's forests, but risk followed them like a shadow. They passed through an abolitionist farm in Delaware, a quiet church basement run by free black families in Wilmington, and a hidden room in a carpenter's shop in Philadelphia. Each stop brought temporary relief: warm food, clean water, whispered blessings, but never complete peace. Even in states where slavery was outlawed, danger had its own geography. Bounty hunters roamed freely, eager to earn rewards by dragging black fugitives back across state lines. One afternoon near Philadelphia, danger erupted without warning. The group had nearly crossed an open field when riders appeared on the crest of a hill, moving too deliberately to be harmless travelers. Without speaking, Clemens pushed everyone toward the nearby forest. They scrambled into a ravine concealed by overgrown brush, flattening themselves against damp earth. The horses passed within 100 meters. The riders scanned the fields with a predator's patience. Grace felt a cough rising in her throat, panic tightening her chest. Haley covered the girl's mouth, her own breath trembling with fear. Minutes stretched into something that felt like hours, but eventually the riders turned away. Relief arrived only when the sound of hooves disappeared completely, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves. When they finally stood, some collapsed with shaking limbs. Clemens, who had fought so long to survive, realized that freedom carried its own fear, the fear of losing what he had reclaimed. 3 weeks after leaving the Miller estate, the group splintered again in Philadelphia. A few fugitives chose to remain in the city's growing black community, tired of running, drawn to the possibility of carving out new lives in anonymity. Others moved north. Clemens, Haley, Hope, and Grace pressed on, their eyes fixed beyond the horizon. Pennsylvania was free soil, but freedom here was conditional, vulnerable to the greed of men eager to return fugitives for profit. Canada, by contrast, offered legal protection that could not be overridden by Southern money. They wanted a border so firm no slave hunter could cross it. The final stretch took them through storm-soaked roads, past homes that took them in with quiet courage. In January 1864, during a bleak winter evening, they crossed into Canada near Buffalo on a ferry tossed by icy waves. When the Canadian shoreline finally came into view, some cried openly. Others simply stared, realizing they were seeing a world where their names could no longer be owned. The family settled in St. Catharines, Ontario, a community shaped by survivors of the same system they had fled. More than 1,000 former American slaves lived there, building neighborhoods, churches, and schools. Clemens found work in carpentry. Haley took a job in a restaurant before opening a small sewing business. Hope and Grace attended school for the first time, stumbling through lessons with the determination of children who wanted to earn the future denied to them. Yet freedom did not wash away trauma. Clemens often woke drenched in sweat, the correction barn returning to him in fevered nightmares. Haley's hands sometimes shook uncontrollably, a ghostly echo of the chisel that had taken her fingers. Hope developed a fear of white men approaching too quickly, while Grace asked questions that had no easy answers. Why some children stayed behind, why their family lived when others didn't. News of the Civil War reached Canada through new arrivals each month. In 1865, word spread that slavery had officially ended in the United States. Celebration rippled through St. Catharines, joy mixed with grief. Freedom had come too late for Sally, for Daniel, for Clemens's 2 lost sons, for thousands buried in unmarked graves. Clemens rarely spoke of Maryland again. When asked about his scars, he answered vaguely, mentioning mistreatment without detailing the horrors he had endured, or the violence he had carried out in return. Haley shared only fragments of truth. Secrecy was not shame. It was protection. The fewer who knew, the fewer who could endanger them. Their lives unfolded quietly over the next decades. Clemens and Haley married in 1866, forming a bond that began in suffering but matured into solid companionship. Hope grew into adulthood, married in 1872, and had 4 children. Grace became a teacher, filling classrooms with the compassion she had once needed herself. Outwardly, their lives resembled peace, but the foundation was built on memories none dared to fully excavate. The surviving Miller children faced different fates. Trauma followed each one into adulthood. The 4-year-old girl, raised by an aunt who resented her, stopped speaking for years. The 8-year-old boy battled nightmares into middle age, dying young from a heart weakened by lifelong anxiety. No one ever uncovered the full truth of what happened that night. Back in Maryland, time swallowed the Miller estate piece by piece. The house stood empty for months, then years. Word of the poisoning spread like an infection. Potential buyers withdrew. Locals refused to farm the land, muttering about curses and restless spirits. By the late 1860s, the roof leaked, gardens tangles of wild growth, windows cracked under the weight of storms. The correction barn rotted faster than the house, its structure collapsing during a fierce storm in 1871. Villagers claimed they heard screams echoing the night it fell, though fear invents its own sounds. In the taverns of Leonardtown, stories grew more fantastic with every telling. Blood that wouldn't wash from the walls, plates that refused to move from the table, ghosts wandering fields at dusk. The truth was simpler. Nature had begun reclaiming what had been stolen from it, and silence had moved into the rooms where cruelty once lived. Clemens lived until 1891. In his final days, weakened by pneumonia, he drifted in and out of lucidity, whispering names: Sally, Daniel, his lost sons, even Anthony. Hope sat by his bedside, holding his hand as his breaths grew shallow. Before dying, Clemens asked Haley whether she believed God would forgive them. She held his hand gently, telling him that God understood necessity in ways humans never could. Whether she believed it or simply needed him to hear it, she carried the promise with her until her own death 15 years later. Haley lived to see the new century, her granddaughters listening to her stories filtered through softened words. She spoke of Daniel, of cold nights during escape, but never of arsenic. Some truths are too heavy to pass down. By the early 1900s, the Miller property had dissolved into memory. Forest swallowed the ruins. The cemetery where the Millers were buried was eventually emptied and relocated, the bones mixed with others until identity blurred into anonymity. Official records quieted the massacre with bureaucratic language, accidental poisoning, and history moved on. Yet in black communities, whispered versions of the story persisted. Clemens became a figure of folklore, sometimes a man who saved dozens, sometimes a myth who brought down an entire plantation in one night. Accuracy mattered less than the truth beneath it, the truth of resistance. Hope lived until 1923, the last living witness to the Miller estate. When her great-grandchildren asked about slavery, she said only that her father had been a brave man who did what was necessary to protect her. When they pressed for details, she changed the subject with a sad smile. Some stories are not meant to be told, only carried. And so, the complete truth died with her, leaving behind fragments, questions, and a silence that spoke more loudly than any confession. But while anyone remembers, even in whispers, even in myth, the night of November 26, 1863, survives. Not as a simple tale of revenge or justice, but as a reminder of what happens when people are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Clemens and Haley did not create the darkness, they revealed it. For one night, hidden cruelty became undeniable, a reckoning centuries overdue. The Miller estate never recovered. The land grew quiet. The wind carried no screams, only the rustling of leaves over buried secrets. And somewhere in that quiet, history keeps breathing, insisting that the past does not disappear simply because those who lived it are gone. If this story made you think about the complicated shadows of America's past, hit the like button and subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, was this justice or something far more difficult to name?